I'm joined in studio by Happy Kambule and Nyoka Naidu. They're from Project 90 by 2030, and they recently attended COP20 in Peru. It sounds like a mouthful, but they're going to explain everything to us. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Happy, won't you just kick us off by explaining what is COP20? I know the last time South Africans were actually very sort of involved and interested in it was when it was hosted in Durban, but what is it?
Yeah, as you said, there's a thing called COP, and COP is basically called the Conference of the Parties. It's where governments meet and they start to talk, or rather they engage on issues around climate change. So what they're trying to do is to come up with an international governance system around climate change, so dealing with issues of greenhouse gases and pollution. So this was the 20th session.
And Nyoka, last time you were here, you spoke to us about your organization, Project 90 by 2030. Won't you briefly explain to us what is your organization, what are you about?
So Project 90 by 2030, it's a mouthful as you said, but the Project 90 and the 90 part of it talks to significant change towards mobilizing a low carbon future in South Africa. And we work in various communities, and specifically Happy and I work in policy and research, moving towards a low carbon future.
Now, were the concerns of your organization or that directive addressed at COP? Is that what it's about? Everybody getting together to try and really have a greener, less carbon intensive world?
I think it's a little bit more complicated than that, because the COP, as Happy explained, is the international arena where these negotiations take place. But we also, Project 90 specifically, works on a national scale. So our community partnership programs work in communities, putting in renewable energy systems as well as adaptation responses. And that's how that is implemented in the national setting.
Great. Now, Happy, won't you speak to us about what the thrust of this particular COP conference was? What were you looking at specifically?
Well, there were a number of things we were looking for specifically. One of them was ideally to get an understanding of what contributions countries are going to put forward leading up to this year, because this year is COP21 in Paris, where this agreement, which was agreed to be signed in Durban. So in Durban, something that's specific about Durban is that Durban made sure that there is a continuation of this regime, this talk beyond the Kyoto Protocol, which was first decided in one of the first few COPs. So this COP, COP20, the specific thing was what forms of contributions and what forms the contribution in terms of what countries will bring forward in their contributions or what they're going to put on the table. Another thing is what are countries going to do in terms of what the Kyoto has decided and what has come out of the Kyoto, and what is missing, because there's what is required by science for countries to cut down their carbon emissions, and there's what countries have already done. And what has come out is that the countries have done something, but it's not enough. So we need to know what's going to happen with that, and then we need to know what's going to happen beyond 2020, which this new regime is going to start. And then there's also issues of finance. How are we going to finance all of this? Because it is a big issue. It is a big issue.
Now, this all comes down to signing the Paris Agreement, if I understand this correctly, and that will happen this year?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, yes.
hopefully, we don't want to talk about, we don't want to make it sound like it will be signed. Government saying they will sign something, it's what they're going to sign, which is important.
You can speak to us about the types of things, just generally, that government are going to be pledging to do as part of the Paris Agreement. Can you give us some examples?
So specifically on a South African, scale, we in the negotiations we talk about adaptation and specifically loss and damage, because most of the agreement is on mitigation. And the difference between mitigation and adaptation is putting in measures to decrease our carbon intensity and our CO2 emissions, but adaptation is actually changing to deal with the ramifications that we can't change at this point. And then if we don't find a good mix between adaptation and mitigation, there's a space called loss and damage. And that's where there's a shortfall, and it can't be addressed. And those are the three spheres where South Africa is trying to get them equally represented in the agreement, because in terms of adaptation and loss and damage, it also needs to be financed. And as South Africa is a developing nation, we need to be aware of those.
Now, I know this is a bit of a difficult question to end off with, but what is the likelihood that that Paris Agreement will be signed this year? What is the likelihood that governments are going to now be held accountable by this larger international body for our carbon emissions? I guess it is a very difficult question.
It's a very difficult
I think what we actually have to look at are the elements that are in the agreement, because it can be signed, but it can have no substantial changes. So we need to see loss and damage, adaptation and mitigation, as well as political will. So the fact that they're signing is fantastic, but there needs to be some sort of I wouldn't say ratification, but so a national implementation strategy that goes along with it, because it's fantastic to sign a treaty with no sort of will to do anything about it. But as you asked, the likelihood of an agreement being signed, I would hope that would be a positive. So us signing a good agreement and what word should I use? Not binding, but an ambitious agreement.
That's great. I think what we're taking away from this is that policy is great, and even having a personal policy on how I want to live my life in terms of my carbon emissions is great, but actually it comes down to implementation and action.
Definitely.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.